This is my heater. I dare you to hit it.
You'll be sorry.
You want the heater? I'll give it to you.
Basketball, maybe they don't hit it.
A swing and a drive to deep right.
Clear the deck. Cannonball coming.
Left field. It is out of here.
All right, welcome back. Baseball Unstitched, rocking and rolling. Ryan and Evan here, ready to do our thing, guys. Time to talk about some baseball and one of the most fun topics in all of baseball. That's right, I'm not talking about home runs. I'm talking about arbitration. What? Arbitration. Yes, we know you may or may not understand how arbitration works, how Super 2 designations work, but we're here today to try to make the arbitration for dummies playbook is really what Flax and I are going for. Flax, how you been? What's going on around baseball today?
We're good. A little bit happening this week. Not a ton. White Sox still moving, still picking people up. Bobby Dahlbeck, minor league contract with an invite to spring training. I'd be shocked if he didn't break camp with them. I think that's a really good pickup on their part. A really surprise trade last week. The Dodgers and the Reds. Gavin Lux moving to Cincinnati. Mike Sirota, outfield prospect from the Reds organization, moving to LA with a comp A round pick. And this again is why the Dodgers have been so successful. They use their high capital players. They seek out trades for what they need to continue to grow their pipeline. People don't want to have that conversation, but the Dodgers do spend money. They also develop and draft extremely well.
And they have a heavy willingness to do this when they sign somebody like Hae-Sung Kim, knowing he can play multiple positions. They felt like Gavin Lux at that point became a expendable asset, and going out to get something for him is great. So I totally agree with you. It's another thing that they do well is really what it is.
Another minor league deal signed. Kevin Biggio signed with the Kansas City Royals. We'll see where he comes from that. He's a super utility player, or so they're calling him. He struggled a little bit to hit the fastball in Toronto. The Nationals signed Ahmed Rosario. I know there was a lot of chatter from you, Ryan, on Twitter around this one. Seemed to be a lukewarm response from Nationals fans. But, I mean, I think for where that team is at with a young core, a guy like Ahmed Rosario is a really good clubhouse pickup for $2 million a year, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. He's filling that super utility role for us. Looks like he's taking over for Ilmar Arias. As long as he's not the everyday third baseman, I think it's a good pickup, but we'll find out what happens.
An update from last week, Josh Rojas. It was determined that he's making $3.5 million for the 1 year he's signed with the White Sox. Again, the White Sox have proven that they're starting from scratch. They're trying a different way to do things. And the real hope is that on the back end, their development cycles will improve and continue to grow the prospect list that they're accruing. Also, the Dodgers, right after they had DFA'd him, Diego Cartaya had been traded to the Twins. A little-known pitching prospect is going back to the Dodgers, a very high upside player that they got out of a guy that they tried to work with in Cartaya, but just never really made something of. He was the number 3 international prospect in 2018 when he was signed out of Venezuela by the Dodgers. Just an interesting note on him. So I think there's still upside there. A good pickup for the Twins, quite honestly, who just need depth and potential. And then the big one yesterday, Jeff Hoffman signs 3 years, $33 million with the Blue Jays. An odd note that came out probably 30 minutes after the signing was announced by the Blue Jays themselves was that the Orioles actually had a 3-year, $40 million offer on the table, ready to sign with Hoffman, but he did not pass his physical with Orioles team doctors. This is not new for the Orioles. If you dig into it, really in the past 10 years or so, there have been 3 or 4 other times where this has happened. The willingness to take risk on bullpen arms and I guess potentially starting arms for guys over extended periods of years is not something the front office has really been willing to do, even in the prior regime with Dan Duquette as well. So an interesting an interesting note that came out of that Jeff Hoffman signing. We'll see where it lands. But the Blue Jays finally got somebody.
They did.
Finally got somebody. Kind of came in second, but still came in first.
It'll be interesting to see what the Blue Jays do here too. Coming in quote unquote first place when he already had a deal in place with somebody else is rough. I know the Blue Jays offseason has been relatively tough. They've been in on everybody. Yeah. And it is worth noting that there was reports that Hoffman did want to get back into the rotation. Obviously, he came up with Colorado as a starting pitcher. Did not have nearly as much success as he had in the bullpen over the last year and a half. So will be interesting to see 3 years, $40 million offer from the Baltimore Orioles. I mean, Flax, I know the team doctors say no, but as an O's fan, I'm sure you're happy to see that there's money that's being thrown around.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is the conversation. You and I have had this many times, and we don't need to dig into this rabbit hole too much, but fans as a whole, they want their team to spend money when they're not fans of the Dodgers and the Mets. And now, I guess, the Yankees again. Every other team is like, well, why aren't we spending as much? Well, sometimes your team has a plan, and there are guys that they want to get and that they are willing to spend the money for. Other times it's about building a roster that meshes well together, fits into the culture, fits into the clubhouse. We've seen plenty of teams win a World Series, go deep in the playoffs, that weren't top 10 in payroll. It's very possible, but you have to find the right pieces. Jeff Hoffman would have been the right piece for the right amount of money had he been within the health standards that the Orioles wanted. That's just a reality of the situation. So, yeah, I'm excited that they're willing to spend. Not shocked. Just, it's got to be for the right player. Also, a note on Jeff Hoffman. Jeff Hoffman was drafted by the Blue Jays and then traded to the Rockies. So Jeff Hoffman back home in Toronto, technically back home,
All right, a lot happened in baseball last week. Flax, thanks for the rundown as always. Let's move into the main topic here today, which is what we're calling arbitration for dummies. We know arbitration is something that most people do not 100% understand as it pertains to what Major League Baseball does, team control, how long you actually have a player with an arbitration. So we're going to try to break it down and make it as simple as humanly possible. And to do that, we feel like we should start at the beginning here. So Flax, how did we get to having arbitration and arbitration hearings?
Yeah, arbitration has been around since probably the mid-1970s. That was when the Major League Baseball Players Association first started utilizing arbitration panels and arbitration hearings to try and achieve some sort of understanding between players and ownership. But when it comes to players that we're going to talk about today that are arbitration eligible, it really started through the 80s to help players who are on rookie contracts but have provided enough time in baseball or enough value to their team, a way to get paid what they are due at fair value for the production that they're providing. So the arbitration process, which we'll get deeper into, has shifted and changed over time. So Ryan, I know you're going to dig into what it is right now, but the goal is really just to create a little bit less pay disparity for players that are in the league, consistently playing, and doing it at a high level.
Yeah. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to just run from the top here. What makes you arbitration eligible? What does an arbitration schedule look like? And give you a full understanding of when somebody says, hey, this player is going through arbitration, you should hopefully have an understanding of what that means. So let's start here. Arbitration eligibility. And it gets confusing really quick, and that's why we're doing this. So arbitration eligibility is determined by your service time within Major League Baseball. For those who do not know, a full Major League Baseball season is around 187 days. To get 1 full year of service time, a player is required to be on an active 26-man roster, for 172 of those 187 days. 172 equals 1 full year. Service time is written as 0.000, which, for example, 1 year and 61 days of service time for a player would be written as 1.061. Why am I telling you that? Because if you go to places like Spot Track or Fangraphs or Baseball Reference, that's exactly how you're going to see Major League service time written within a player's breakdown. Now, arbitration comes into factor after the first 3 years of Major League service time for most players. So years 1 through 3, a player will get generally the Major League minimum contract at that point in time. Right now, it's around just a little over $750,000 for players. In years 4 through 6, players will be arbitration eligible. What this allows those players to do is now have some type of say in their salary throughout those 3 years. Now, in year 7, that player becomes a free agent, as everybody knows. Just because you're arbitration eligible doesn't mean you're going to get paid at the level of which you would if you were a free agent or valued on the open market. There are 2 different designations when it comes to arbitration. There is standard arbitration, which means after 3 years of service, again, in that case, it would be 3.000 or more. You are arbitration eligible. You would go into year 1 of arbitration, which would allow you to start negotiating your salary. The second designation is what's called a Super 2. A Super 2 is basically an expedited arbitration status. And what it does is it allows the players to have an additional year of arbitration, essentially 1 year earlier than they would have initially. And now they have 4 total years of arbitration instead of 3. So years 1 and 2 would be on a Major League minimum contract. Years 3 through 6 would now be quote unquote arbitration eligible years. With the Super 2 designation also comes a minor bump in the amount of money you may or may not receive, because most Super 2 eligible players are going to be guys who've had 1 more service time. And generally, because of that, there is a little more success attached to these players. How are you determined to be a Super 2 player? A Super 2 player is the top 22% of players within their quote-unquote class. That class is going to be any player who finishes the season with between 2 and 3 years of service time. In most classes, Super 2 cutoff is going to be between 2 years and 120 days and 2 years and 150 days or more of service time. The example would be in the 2024 offseason, or this offseason, the Super 2 cutoff was 2 years and 132 days. So any player within that 2 to 3 year span who had more than that service time was eligible to be a Super 2 player and earn an additional year of salary arbitration. Now that you have a basic idea of the designations, Flax, how is arbitration executed?
It's a process that goes about a month, from mid-January to mid-February. Starting in mid-January, teams, agents, players sit down and say, from the player side, this is what I think I should get paid. Owner side says, this is what I think you should get paid. And they come to some consensus on a dollar figure. That is the majority of arbitration players. A minority of arbitration players come to the table and say, I believe I should make this much. The team says, I don't think you should make that much. And they can't come to an agreement. At which point, and this year the date was January 9th, they have to submit prior to the deadline a figure from both sides that says, this is what I believe they should get paid. Then it goes to a hearing in front of 3 arbitrators in an arbitration panel. And then in February, at said hearing, both player and team have to stand up in front of the other and give an explanation of why they believe they should make the money that they believe the player should make. In most cases, teams would like to avoid this hearing. It's not good for the relationship. And in a lot of cases, the player does come out earning more money and winning a lot of those cases. So between that time period, that 3 weeks to a month, where the team and the player have put their numbers into the public, they do get an opportunity to go sit down, try and negotiate, and settle before going to a hearing. That's oftentimes what we see, but there have definitely been some high-profile cases where things do go to a hearing and the teams and the players don't settle prior. So that's the process. Again, it's pretty straightforward. It's as you would imagine it. And I think it'll make a little bit more sense when we dig in a little bit later in the episode into some cases that are going on right now.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think there are some cases this year that people will be interested to hear about that we're going to touch on. Arbitration hearings can be a very slippery slope. Can you imagine going to your office and saying, I deserve this? Your company says you deserve this, and it's a lot less money. And a panel of 3 people sit there and say, well, you guys should tell us why each of you think what you think. And right in front of you, your company tells you, hey, he's not worth this much because of X. That'd be rough. And we're not saying that's what always
job
happens.
pretty quick.
Yeah, I have a feeling most people would. So understandably, it's understandable.
But also understand, right? Like, when you look at this whole thing, it's like anything else in the sphere of baseball. It is used and manipulated. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I just mean it in the sense of, as straightforward as the process exists, is not as straightforward as the process gets used. And that's what we're going to talk a lot about. But before we get there, I know we want to dig into a couple examples of arbitration schedules, because that's really the last piece for people to completely understand the whole concept of arbitration. So I'll hold off until we get to that conversation.
100%. So another piece of why we had this discussion is because, well, we had the opportunity to be on X and a couple other social media platforms. We've seen a lot of people who were very confused about whether or not certain players were potentially going to be free agents after the 1-year salary increase contracts that have been signed. We've seen people say that about guys like George Kirby and some other players. So rest assured, those guys are still on your roster. They will still be on your roster. More than likely, I believe Kirby's in his first year of eligibility for the next 3 years, unless they decide to move him for some other random reason. So let's walk through a generic arbitration schedule. Who are we going to use as this example? We're going to use Washington Nationals starter Mackenzie Gore, one of my favorite players right now, because I'm a little bit of a homer. However, Gore has a great schedule to show you as an example. Here's why. Mackenzie Gore has racked up exactly 3 years of Major League service time, making him the perfect person to utilize for this. Mackenzie Gore's first 3 seasons in the league, he earned a league minimum, 1 full season with the Padres, 2 full seasons with the Washington Nationals. That makes him this year, for the 2025 season and the 2024 offseason, arbitration eligible for the first time. Mackenzie Gore's arbitration schedule will be as straightforward as humanly possible. Gore will be arbitration eligible for his year 4, 2025, his year 5, 2026, and his year 6, 2027. And then if he has not come to any type of extension agreement with the Washington Nationals, he would become a 2028 free agent prior to his year 7 playing his year 7 in the league. So there's your generic arbitration schedule. Again, laying it out simple, 3 years of league minimum, more than likely, 3 years of arbitration. Now you're a free agent. Now, let's move to the slightly more complicated Super 2 situation. Super 2 is interesting because a lot of teams will try and do some type of service manipulation in order to not have to pay an additional arbitration year. It's better for teams to have really good players on league minimum contracts for as long as humanly possible, especially for mid-market teams. Before we jump into Chris Bryant, who's going to be our example for this, let's just give you a great today example of why. The Cleveland Guardians right now have what's considered the 4 horsemen in their bullpen: Emmanuel Clase, Hunter Gaddis, Cade Smith, and Tim Herron. Those 3 guys right now, the Cleveland Guardians next year will pay them around $8 million. We're talking about what was considered the best back-end bullpen, in my opinion, in all of baseball. Every single one of those guys was under like a 2.5 ERA. It moved. Can you imagine getting that type of value out of the best closer in baseball and then what is essentially the 3 of the best high leverage arms? Flax, I think you'd take that every day of the week at $8-some million.
Yeah, that's absurd.
100%. So now you can understand why a mid-market team like the Guardians likes to be avoiding this as much as possible from a Super 2 perspective and will manipulate service time to keep that from happening. So let's dive into the example of a Super 2 now in Chris Bryant. Chris Bryant, if for those who remember, making me feel a little bit older here because I'm realizing this was all 11 years ago. In 2014, when Chris Bryant was brought up, there was a whole stink about why he did not break camp with the team that year, because he looked more than ready in spring training. Everybody knew the caliber of player he was. They waited about a week and a half to bring him up. Now, this didn't end up 100% affecting his Super 2 eligibility, but it did also help the Cubs to earn an additional year of overall controllability with him. Had this service time that they did not give him affected his Super 2 eligibility, he also would have then been pushed to a standard arbitration schedule, and the Cubs would not have had to go through 4 years of arbitration with him. Instead, it would have just been 3. Ergo, taking what was an MVP caliber Chris Bryant and paying him less in that third year after winning the MVP, which they did not get to do. So, what did his schedule look like? Chris Bryant came up. He had 2 years of league minimum, of which in the second year he won the league MVP. His year 3, he was arbitration eligible. His year 4, he was arbitration eligible. His year 5, he was arbitration eligible. And his year 6, he was arbitration eligible. And then would eventually hit free agency in year 7. So again, what Super 2 did for Chris Bryant specifically is give him 1 more year to help control his salary.
He didn't give the Cubs much of a choice, quite honestly.
No.
I mean, that year in spring training, he led the MLB in home runs. He hit like 9 home runs in spring training, which means he hit 9 home runs in a month.
Yep.
At his level, one of the first time seeing major league pitching, like he didn't give him a choice. It would have been a very, very clear effort of service time manipulation, which you cannot do, by the way. They probably would have taken it to, they probably would have filed a grievance from the MLBPA if he had not been brought up by the time he had for that team.
Yep, showing 40 home run pace in spring training generally finds your way on a roster.
Yeah.
So, again, Super 2's a little bit different, but the real big piece of Super 2's here is to award players who have had more service time early in their careers. So now that we've gone through eligibility, how it works, an arbitration schedule with hopefully 2 good digestible examples for you, Flax, how do we even get to a number for these players?
Yeah, somewhat confusing, but the crux of it is we want to take the value of the player as it's measured. Right now, the way it's measured is some form of wins above replacement. There's a bunch of different places that calculate it differently. Teams have their own calculations of it, but that is an average marker of how good or how much value you provide to the team as an individual player. And then we take that times your designation and your years of service, and we get some form of a number. There are unique use cases, like some of the ones we're going to talk about, where guys are heads above their competition. And when you align them not to those also in arbitration, but when you align them to those that are in free agency, there's some middle ground number between those two where they probably land. But there's a standard mathematical equation. The league, the owners, the players, they're trying to keep this situation as black and white as possible. Again, they're trying to avoid negotiations. They're trying to avoid going to a hearing. They just want to keep it as simple as possible. Pay the guy what he's is fair value. Let him play another year. He's on your team. You've got to work with him for another 2 years. I mean, again, this is the great equator to our own lives being in an office. If you sign a contract to work for a company for 3 years, and after year 1, someone sits in a room with you and says, "I don't think you're very valuable," those next 2 years are going to be pretty tough, right? You're not going to want to keep doing that job. You're not going to bring your best stuff to the ballpark. So, I'm gonna write an article. We're going to dig deeper into this, but the crux of it really is it's very black and white. There is a mathematical equation, and that's how we tend to land on it.
Yeah, and if you are curious about that equation of how they do it, there's a really good chart on Fangraphs. We highly recommend that you guys go take a look at their website, take a look at their chart. There's actually a chart for not only standard arbitration, but Super 2 as well. Because like we said, Super 2 does tend to be guys who are more successful in the league a little bit earlier. Otherwise, why would they have all that service time so much quicker in their career? So
I saw yesterday, actually, in the history of arbitration, I believe about 90% of salary hearings that actually went to a hearing came from a player with a Super 2 designation. So again, it's more times than not a player that is already high value. The MLB has basically said, yeah, you were close enough to 3 years. You're already really good. There's a reason you're close enough to 3 years already. You should get paid. And the team obviously is trying to not cut their losses, but not end up paying exorbitant amounts over a longer period of time. I mean, a great, like a guy that we want to talk about in today's world in 2025 that just signed and settled outside of arbitration was Vlad Guerrero Jr.
Yep.
Signed for $28.5 million. Pretty close to what I think he's probably going to get AAV when he signs his free agency contract next year. He's in his last year of arbitration, but very clearly the Blue Jays did not want to go to a hearing. He agreed on that number extremely quickly. He was one of the first that was even announced as having that contract in place. And it's important to understand a relationship exists here. He's been with this ball club now 5-6 years. They can't risk sitting in a room and telling him he's not worth a dollar value. You'd rather almost overpay him now knowing that you're underpaying what a potential extension is going to look like next year. Where you could have extended him earlier this year for a higher value. In some respect, they are saving money. So, yeah, it's an interesting situation. At least off the rip when I look at it.
Yeah, and Vlad, it's so tough for the Blue Jays right now in many different ways, and we've had that discussion. It's been a really hard offseason. The last couple of off seasons have been tough. They've been in on a lot of really solid superstar players. They haven't been able to land any of these guys. So when you look at a homegrown talent like Vladimir Guerrero Jr. for the Blue Jays, it's going to be really important for them to settle these types of things and basically probably allow Vlad to come to the table and say, hey, we think you're worth this. Tell us what you think you're worth. Okay, that's more than what we thought, but you know what? That works for us. Please, please, please stay in Toronto long term. We're more concerned about the extension of which you might be able to sign. What he ended up avoiding arbitration for was $28.5 million, which I think you may have already mentioned. Blue Jays didn't care, is probably the fact of the matter. They just wanted to make sure that it was a relatively fair number. He was on the roster, and there was no shot of souring their relationship to talk about that extension.
No, I don't expect we see an extension offer in the next probably couple of weeks because, by signing this contract, you're basically saying we can sweep this contract into your extension and we can sign something now before spring training, before the season starts. This is now the value that we're going off of. Realistically, he's probably going to get the largest first baseman contract we've ever seen. Yep. It may not be in total contract value, but in annual value, I have no doubt he's going to get $30 plus million AAV, especially if this is what he's getting out of arbitration.
100%. And a good reminder for everybody, again, as we just had the Soto contract signed. He will be coming to free agency at 26, 27 years old. The contract length will be really long, which will balloon the total value of the number. So though there might be many out there who don't think he's $500 plus million contract, if he signs a 15-year deal, there's just a high likelihood that the number is going to be that high at the end of the day.
Right.
So levels of risk that they'll take no matter what. Flax, there's a couple other use cases that we wanted to go off of. Who's next on our list here for the 2024 offseason arbitration?
Yeah, next on the list that is going to arbitration and could not come to an agreement is Kyle Tucker. This is a really interesting situation because Kyle Tucker has never played for the Cubs. He's new to the ownership group. He came in at a number of $17.5 million. The Cubs submitted a number of $15 million. A gap of $2.5 million is pretty large, which tells me that the Cubs kind of lowballed here. But I think they did it with intention. I don't think they did it to tell Kyle Tucker, this is what you're valued at. I think they did it to say, we're going to buy ourselves 2 to 3 more weeks before the arbitration hearing happens to potentially get in a room, negotiate, and maybe even get an extension signed at a much higher value, right? This is the time for them to sit there and say, we can go to arbitration and you're going to make your 17.5, and that's fine. We'll walk in there and say, no ill will, this is what he deserves, whatever. Or we'll settle on it right before the hearing. But You could make a lot more money this year and sign an extension at what your fair value truly is and be with us for the next 5 to 6 years. That's what I really think is going on here, because otherwise I don't think the Cubs would have come in at such a low number. Very clearly, Kyle Tucker is worth what he is submitting, because Kyle Tucker is going to sign a massive extension next year if he does make, or a massive free agent contract next year if he makes it to free agency. We're talking very similar numbers to Vlad Guerrero with the production that Kyle Tucker's put up, at least at this point in his career.
Yeah, and we talk about how these arbitration cases work. Let's say that they don't come to any type of extension deal, like we think that's probably part of what the stall here is for the Cubs. The Cubs could walk into the arbitration hearing and say, hey, turns out Kyle Tucker is worth every dollar that he's telling you he's worth. Go ahead and pay him. And they just walk out. Like, there's nothing that would stop that from necessarily happening. So,
no, you don't have to get in there and disparage a player. No
100%.
One's forcing that upon you.
So, very interesting. We all know that with what the Cubs gave up, a Kyle Tucker extension is probably at top of mind. So this does kind of track for us, giving them a little bit more time to potentially say, hey, we'll pay you more on the front end if you want to come sign a large extension.
Yeah. Another one that's going to arbitration that's I don't even know if I want to call it an interesting use case is Michael King. I don't know what the Padres are doing here. I think, unfortunately, that organization's got a lot going on. Michael King submitted an $8.8 million number. Padres submitted $7.325. To me, that sounds like Michael King is taking a player comp perspective, and the Padres basically took a very hard and fast number and said, this is the mathematical number you should get. Here it is. If I'm the Padres and I look at what Michael King has done to solidify that starting rotation, with guys coming in, coming out, what he's done in the playoffs to be a consistent arm, and how much he's improved. I mean, you guys all know how I feel about it. I think he's a potential Cy Young candidate.
Money where his mouth is.
I put it out there. Plus 2,000, Michael King, Cy Young. But this is a situation that's very reminiscent of Corbin Burns in Milwaukee. And we know how that ended up, right? In the middle, before his walk year even happened, the Brewers traded him. He was never going to be happy there. He was never going to sign an extension there. They got for him what they could get for him with the most value that he was providing at the moment. And that's what I see for Michael King in the near future. If they do end up going to a hearing and he loses out, or even sits there and listens to someone disparage him.
Can you give a quick rundown of what happened to Corbin Burns in 2023 and what led to that situation?
Yeah, so in 2021, Corbin Burns wins the Cy Young. Corbin Burns is making league minimum $605,000. Corbin Burns in 2020 also had a very, very good season. In 2022, he had a very good season. In 2023, prior to that arbitration, Corbin Burns had what I would call an off year for him. I would say he was still one of the top 25% of pitchers in baseball, but for him and what he had done the 2 years prior, it wasn't the same. That being said, having won a Cy Young on a rookie contract, Corbin Burns came in at a figure that was $740,000 more than what the Brewers wanted to pay him. Instead of coming to some agreement in the middle, the Brewers said, no, we're going to go to a hearing. Ultimately, the Brewers end up winning in that arbitration hearing. Corbin Burns doesn't get the $750,000 that he thought he should get because most of it was based on his prior year of service. And Corbin Burns and the relationship with the Brewers was soured over having to go into an arbitration hearing and listen to basically being told, yeah, we just don't think you're that valuable. We don't think you're as good as you think you are. You know, we think those 2 years you had, that Cy Young was a flash in the pan. We think you're more likely to continue regressing to where you were last season. And then go to a lot of the comments and a lot of articles that were made by Corbin Burns. He believes that that was a really big reason they didn't make the playoffs that year in 2023. Because Corbin Burns was not in the headspace to really bring his best stuff to the ballpark like we had talked about. It wasn't a comfortable place that he wanted to be pitching for. And that's what I think the Padres are doing to Michael King. I think you could very easily see Michael King in the next couple of years in a totally different jersey, signing a free agent contract somewhere else, or getting traded somewhere else because there's clearly no opportunity for extension. And that's what happens in baseball. If a guy's in a position where he's very clearly not going to stay with the team long term, that team will trade him because you want to get something for a guy. You don't want him to just walk away at the end of the year and say, well, we could have traded him and got some prospects, but instead we held on to him and now he's gone and we've got nothing. So my hope for the Padres, my hope for Michael King is that they do come to an agreement somewhere in the middle of the $1.5 million that's between them so that they don't sour a relationship, because I think Michael King would be really good for the Padres over the long term.
Sure. And it's very important for us to say, too, we could be wrong about what we think was going on from the situation, right? We're deducting this from what we're seeing.
And what we've seen in arbitration cases in the past.
Yeah, 100%. So, look, what we would prefer to see in reality is in a week or two, they announce a Michael King extension. And maybe this is a situation that is more like Kyle Tucker's. That would be the preferred thing here. The last thing that we want to see is players and teams having these situations happen, regardless of if it's potentially better for other teams or however that shakes out. So, right. Michael King, very interesting. One of the breakout stars, in my opinion. I think he's been better than people realize over the last couple of years, but was definitely a elite pitcher in 2024. And we got to see that on display, especially in his first start of the playoffs this year. It was absolutely electric. So
it was awesome.
We're going to hope that is solved in some way, shape, or form, probably before going to arbitration, because both Flax and I believe if it does go to a hearing, it could get a little messy for Michael King and Padres fans. Now, final use case that we wanted to go over is Willem Contreras. And I find this one to be really interesting because Willem Contreras is a Super 2, and he wants more money than what the Brewers are willing to offer him. Oh gosh, we're talking about Brewers again. But let's talk about why we actually believe he might be asking for a little too much. Flax, can you go into this case a little bit deeper?
Yeah, and this is a situation where if it does go to a hearing, I don't think either side's going to sour a relationship because it's pretty cut and dry. I don't think the arbitrators would have a long deliberation over this. Willem Contreras aligns really well with two players, Cal Raleigh, Adley Rutschman. They're all three Super 2s. They're all three at the same point in their arbitration schedule. And their wins above replacement, their team value is pretty much the same across the board. When you look at that, those other two players signed for a figure of around $5.5 million, much closer to the Brewers number. My guess is that if it does go to a hearing, the Brewers walk in and say, pretty cut and dry. There's a pretty clear comp here. We see tons of value in you, just like those teams see tons of value in their players. This is the going rate for the player at this caliber and at this value. That is what it is. And I don't know that Contreras really would have much of a leg to stand on against that discussion. And I almost expect that this will get settled before it even gets there, just for that pure fact. I just think they were far off from each other without understanding the situation in its entirety. But yeah, it's about as clear cut as it gets, in my opinion.
I think so too. So Willem Contreras submitted for $6.5 million. That's the salary he was looking for in 2025. The Brewers submitted for $5.6 million. Cal Raleigh and Adley Rutschman both settled prior to submitting numbers for arbitration at $5.5 million this year. So the Brewers basically said, look, here's the player comps. Here's the two Super 2 catchers who are here. Here's what they settled at. Our number is $5.6 million, which makes you paid $100,000 more. This is what we feel is fair. Willem said, I want $6.5 million. Hey, you got to put a 5-star review on all of your employee engagement surveys. What is it when your company asks you? Oh, your self-assessments.
Your self-evaluation.
If you're not self-evaluating yourself at 5 stars, right, there's probably something going down. So to me, this was Willem Contreras saying, 5-star guy here in every facet. I want $6.5 million. And And the Brewers are simply saying, hey, we get it. Player comps say this. We're happy to pay you $100,000 more than these guys, so you are getting paid more than them. So I would agree, have a feeling that this one's not a huge deal, but just an interesting situation, and also how teams and people are getting to these numbers, right? The Brewers submitted that number knowing that it is a relatively fair offer, and there is a high likelihood that the arbiters, if they go that way, are probably going to go their direction in this case. So there you go. Arbitration for dummies. If you still feel like a dummy, I apologize. We tried. And
we went in circles doing research about this, just so everybody knows, trying to wrap our heads around these different pieces, and the way that we ended up blocking it out took us a little bit of time to really figure out the best way to explain it so that it was digestible, because it is confusing if you're not in the midst of it.
For the sake of it, we're humans. This is the second time we're recording this because we needed it to make as much possible sense for everybody as we could. We both have a good understanding of general arbitration, but there are just such nuances, and explaining it is obviously very difficult. So we hope you enjoyed this conversation, and this puts you in a spot where when you start looking at players, you start doing your own research on a player, it allows you to understand their controllability and what they may or may not get paid moving forward, and how an arbitration case could potentially affect their relationship with your team and long-term prospects. Now, deep breath.
Real quick,
Go ahead.
if nothing else, I did learn the difference between an arbiter and an arbitrator through this process.
Hey, there we go. That's a win. Look, man, we got to be prepared.
Small wins.
There's always a win that can be had. So let's turn one win into another win with everybody's favorite, much more relaxed segment, Will They, Won't They? And speaking of wins, FanDuel and all of the betting sites have recently dropped team win totals. So today we're going to do the Will They, Won't They on team win totals. And then we're also going to jump back into everybody's favorite stat in baseball, player home runs. Flax, this is your segment, baby. Run it.
Team win totals. Will they, won't they? Cincinnati Reds over under 84.5 wins. What do you have?
Tito Francona. Loved you for a long time. When that dude stole your scooter in Cleveland, I was ready to hunt him down and find your scooter. But the cops found your scooter first. The Cincinnati Reds will win 80-plus games for sure, and they will actually make the playoffs this year. I think the Reds might win 90 games.
Wow.
Yeah, that is a young roster. Francona knows how to get the most out of young guys, and I am so excited to watch him get his hands on great, talented young players like Ellie De La Cruz, like Christian Encarnacion Strand, Spencer Steer. That roster is great. Hunter Green just posting videos of him mowing down people just because he can.
Such a baller move.
I just love
posting videos of yourself just mowing hitters down.
I wish I could post videos of myself just mowing hitters down. That'd be sick. So
he's starting in division rivalries there with the Pirates.
It really was, because it was literally him. Just go on his Twitter account. It's pretty funny, guys. But
I wish Paul Skeens had just quote tweeted it with a video of him mowing down
Reds. That would have been sick. Oh,
that would have been the right move.
Oh, Paul, since we know you obviously listen to this podcast, do it. That'd be great.
Livy, since you manage his social media, like guaranteed, you do it.
We might have to tag Livy in that one and ask if she could post the video. So yeah, over 79.5 wins for the Cincinnati Reds. They absolutely will. Let's go to mine here. Everybody's favorite evil empire in baseball right now, the Los Angeles Dodgers. Will they, won't they win over 103.5 games?
Nope.
Oh!
I got it at 101.
Whoa!
And there's no reasoning behind this other than that winning baseball games is really, really, really hard.
Love it.
And winning 101 baseball games is really, really, really hard. I've got them just below the number. Listen, Vegas sets odds very, very well. They
Yeah,
got
they
a
do.
lot of analytics behind it. If they're setting it at 103.5, there's very good reason for it. The high likelihood for a number on that end of the spectrum is that they come in just below. So I'm taking my betting experience and saying I do not believe they will crest over the 103 win mark. Again, they've got 9 starters. That could be a 1 or a 2 on any team in baseball. So there's a very high likelihood they could win 120 games. But I'm standing firm on 101 games.
I like it. Everybody's gunning for that team. There's one thing we can guarantee is that every game that they will play, they will be getting the absolute best from every team that walks into the stadium to play them that day.
Listen, the dog days of summer are they don't avoid anybody. And if the if the Dodgers at any point in the middle of the summer start to take a lull, they will get, like you said, the best of everyone they face. And there's just a potential that, everyone hits a cold streak, everyone hits a slide. I just think winning over 103 games is extremely difficult. It just doesn't happen, especially not today, especially now with a balanced schedule.
Did we have a 100-game winner last year?
I don't know if we had a 100-game winner last year. I know we had multiple the year before.
I would have to look again. For some reason, I don't think we had a 100-game winner last year. But don't quote me on that, because that could very well be wrong. Let's rock and roll.
Big of you to admit.
I'm honest. Let's rock and roll to home runs here. I'll go first on this one, since you got to go
you
first
kick it
on
off.
win totals. The over-under is actually a little bit lower than this on FanDuel. I think this guy might do a little bit more. Say, will they, won't they? Cody Bellinger over 25.5 home runs. Oh, come on.
You're just setting me up to say no so much today. I don't want to say no, but listen, Cody Bellinger is a far cry away from that 2019 season. I understand the short porch in Yankee Stadium, but quite honestly, I don't think he's going to play enough games to hit that many home runs. I think you're probably going to have him somewhere in the 17 to 20, maybe 17 to 19 range of home runs. I don't see him posting that kind of number unless he gets super hot and plays every single day. But I mean, listen, let's be realistic. If he goes out there and plays 135 to 140 games, I don't think he's got enough to get that many home runs in at the clip he's been hitting. That's my feeling.
This might be the one that I listen to your words and I say wrong, and then I go on FanDuel and bet the number. This might be the one that I bet the number. We'll let everybody know.
If everybody faded my bets for the rest of their life, they do just fine. I don't have a great track record.
I'll keep that in mind moving forward. But I've given you some advice too, and it hasn't gone really well. Saquon Barkley. Yeah, it's all right. What do you got for me?
Let me get adventurous.
Yeah.
All right. Player home run total over under on my side. I have Jake Cronenworth. I have 23.5 home runs over under.
I'm going to go under. I do enjoy watching Cronenworth play baseball. I just think that lineup's really good, and I think there's a higher likelihood he starts hitting more in the 7-8 hole. It's going to happen sooner or later, in my opinion. The talent on that roster is extremely good. If he's hitting that low in the lineup, it's going to make it hard for him to get enough at bats to do that. Cronenworth is also, from a production perspective, been very up and down over X amount of years in Major League Baseball. He's had some really, really good years early, but like anything else, the league did make a really, really solid adjustment to Cronenworth. Still worth it, still should be on the roster and a great piece of the Padres. However, 23.5 home runs is quite rich for me as it pertains to Cronenworth, so I'm going under on Jake Cronenworth.
Listen, I don't fault you for that. I understand. We don't have to agree on everything. This might be the first week we've really disagreed on.
Whoa! So you got Croney over?
I do. I think he's gonna return to form this year. I really do.
I mean, I want to see it happen. We don't bet against people because we want them to do poorly. It's just what it is, guys.
No.
So
listen, I'm also hoping for a return to form of Major League Baseball where home runs just go absolutely bananas.
You know, it turns out the steroid era was fun to watch for a reason.
Bring steroids back.
Yeah. Okay. And with that, I think we should probably move on to our finish. Flax, outside of bring steroids back, do you have any other final thoughts?
No major thoughts. Again, like I said, arbitration article is going to come out. It'll come out on Twitter, but it'll also come out on the blog as well. Go subscribe to the blog if you want those direct to your email versus finding them on Twitter. Go follow us on Twitter. We're getting into the chatter of baseball Twitter for better and worse. But we hope you enjoy our takes. If you enjoy them in long form, you'll enjoy them even more in short form.
And if you don't like them, tell us too. We're not going to be hurt. We'd be happy to interact with you.
Please comment. Please comment on our articles. Please comment on our tweets. We enjoy the engagement. We enjoy being told we're wrong.
100%.
We won't fight you.
We are sales guys. We hear it all the time. My final thoughts. Spring training invitations are getting sent out in the mail in a flurry. If you want to know why I'm saying that, just go look at the transaction report for the Kansas City Royals, as Evan and I were laughing about the other day. Your teams are going to start to show you who's going to get an opportunity in spring training to at least be at Major League camp. Our example would be the Kansas City Royals are bringing Jack Caglione to Major League camp this year and other top prospects like Gavin Cross. Those got announced yesterday, which would be Saturday, the 11th. So know that all of your teams, if it's not the Kansas City Royals, will also be sending out their spring training invites to Major League spring training. And it could be very interesting to see who's getting an opportunity this year and to see who's just going to get to sit in the clubhouse. One of the reasons why we love Caglione there is because it allows Caglione to get to see the Major League clubhouse, interact with Major League guys who are going to be a really important part of his career development here moving forward when he potentially gets there this year or next year. So spring training invitations, they're out. And if you're expecting to get one, check the mail. Never know. I still haven't gotten one. I've been waiting for years, but one day it'll happen.
Never know.
One day. So that's what we've got for you here on Baseball Unstitched. We appreciate all of you as always. We hope you have a wonderful week. And we'll talk to you on Twitter or next week. Have a good one.